And the next one we have there is broken function level authorization. This vulnerability occurs when a user can access the unauthorized functionality which they shouldn't be able to access. This vulnerability arises when the API implementation lacks proper checks and validation on the user's identity, privilege, and roles. Attackers can exploit this vulnerability to gain unauthorized access to sensitive functionalities or data, leading to various security risks and impacts. The broken function level authorization vulnerability can have severe consequences, including unauthorized access to sensitive information. Attackers can exploit this vulnerability to gain unauthorized access to sensitive functionality or data, such as personal information, financial data, or confidential data. Account takeover. Attackers can use the compromised account to perform unauthorized activity, such as transferring funds, creating or deleting data, and even accessing other systems or applications. Reputational damage. The data breach or unauthorized access can damage the organization's reputation and trust with its user, partners, and stakeholders. Legal and regulatory consequences. If the data breach results in the loss or theft of personal or financial data, the organization may face legal and regulatory consequences, such as lawsuits, fines, or penalties. To prevent the broken function level authorization vulnerability, organizations should consider the implementing the following measures. Role-based access control. RBAC assigns users specific roles and privileges based on their job functions and responsibilities. This ensures that each user can access only the authorized functionalities and data. Access controls ensure that users can only access the authorized functionality and data based on their roles, privileges, and identity. Access control should include authentication, authorization, and validation checks to prevent unauthorized access. The API gateway acts as a central point of control for API access and enforces policies such as authentication, authorization, and rate limiting to prevent unauthorized access and abuse. Organizations should conduct regular security testing, such as penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, to identify and remediate any security weaknesses, including broken function level authorization vulnerability. The broken function level authorization vulnerability is a severe security risk in API development, which can result in unauthorized access to sensitive data and functionality. Organizations should implement role-based access controls, API gateway, and security testing to prevent this vulnerability and ensure a secure API development. So here in the application, Cloud City is a cloud hosting provider that offers virtual servers for developers, startup, and enterprise customers. Alice, the CTO of Cloud City, has engaged a cybersecurity consultant Bob to perform regular penetration tests against the Cloud City application and its associated infrastructure. Penetration testing, also called as pen testing or ethical hacking, is the practice of testing a computer system, network, or web application to find security vulnerabilities that would be attacker would exploit. For testing the purpose, the Cloud City IT team has configured Bob a single test account to access the Cloud City application. Bob begins his assessment by logging on to the Cloud City website with the following test credentials. As Bob, I would go ahead and log into the Cloud City using the username and password. Having successfully logged in, Bob begins his assessment by browsing through Cloud City user interface menus and function to get a field for the product and further identity test scenario and develop security test cases. Bob's account privilege are restricted to only access Cloud City's monitoring dashboard. So accessing the settings page, Bob notices that the page makes an HTTP request to the API to retrieve the current user data. Look like the get HTTP request is made to the slash API slash user ID API endpoint where the user ID represents the identifier of the user. Being an experienced penetration tester, Bob knows that the URL parameters such as user ID are a common source of security vulnerabilities. So Bob decided to modify the request by changing the user value parameter to the ID of another user. Looked like the Bob assumption was wrong as he was not able to access the data of another user. Trying to access the data of another user via GET request, Bob receives the 403 forbidden error. This means that the GET API user ID API endpoint correctly checks the ID of the current user and forbids unauthorized access to the data of another user. Bob decided to try his luck one more time by changing not only the user ID parameter of the request but also the HTTP method of the request. The HTTP method here is get. Now we will set to the delete. See, HTTP defines a set of request method to indicate the desired action to be performed for a given resource, although they can also be none. These request methods are sometimes referred to as HTTP verbs. The most common HTTP methods are get, post, put, and delete. As Bob, I would go ahead and modify the request by changing its HTTP method from get to delete. Interesting. This time the response is different and the status indicates that the request was completed successfully. First, Bob notices the status of the request is not 200 OK, which means that the request was successful. The response body even contains the message, which explains that Bob was actually able to completely delete his NSS account, something that only an admin should be able to do. So here is the vulnerable code. To understand what happened, go ahead and analyze the vulnerable code. Broken function level authorization is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to utilize the API endpoint to which he is not supposed to have access. Usually, the attacker figures out the hidden admin API methods and invokes them directly. Cloud City developer created a user controller REST controller responsible for processing the operation related to users. The getUser function method to controller provides an API endpoint get API user ID which allows the user to retrieve the data from his account. It checks if the user ID parameter of the request equals the ID of the user and only acts if the user ID is correct. The delete user method provides an API endpoint delete API user ID responsible for the deletion of the user. This functionality is intended to be used by only by Cloud City admins. However, the developer did not implement any authorization check for the delete method, relying on the fact that the request to this endpoint is only done from the admin dashboard. So regularly users are not supposed to know about it. By finding and utilizing this insecure endpoint, Bob managed to maliciously violate the data of another user. To effectively mitigate against broken function level authorization vulnerabilities, developers must ensure proper authentication and authorization check for each API endpoint, even if some of them are hidden from the user interface perspective. In this mitigated example, the developer utilized Spring pre-authorized annotation. It checks the role of the user and only allows the access if the user has admin rights. Since Bob is a regular user and not an admin, he cannot access the delete API user ID API endpoint anymore.